Using the file input element is not the only way of getting files into your browser. Many modern browsers now support drag and drop. And in this example, we're going to see how to process a drag and drop event to get file information, which is pretty similar to using the file input element, only in this case, we're using the drag and drop events. So I've got my drag and drop start file open here, and I'm going to jump over to the snippets and copy some code over. But before I do that, let's just take a quick look at how this particular HTML file is different. So first, when I scroll down here, you'll notice that the form is gone. I'm not using the file input element anymore. I have this right here. This div is the file drop zone. This is the area where the user will drop the files. And then I have another div down here, which will show the information about the files that were dropped. So if I scroll back up, you'll see that I have a CSS style here declared to make the drop area big enough and visible so the user can actually drop things into it. It's a big box with a dashed gray outline around it, and we're going to just let the user drop files there instead of using the file input element. So I'll scroll back down here. Let's go to the snippets. So the first thing we need to do is copy over the function that's going to handle the dragging events. So let's copy this function right here. And this is the onDragOver event handler. And what it's basically doing is calling the events stop propagation and prevent default functions. And the reason for that is because when the user drags the files over the div that we've specified as the drop area, we don't want the browser handling the drop and drag operations. We want the browser to not do whatever its default operation is, which is usually to try to open the file. We want the div to be able to handle the event itself. So we're going to copy that in. And then we'll copy the onFilesDropped function. And this is the code that gets called when the drop actually happens. And similarly, I have to call these two functions to make sure that the browser doesn't try to open the files. And then from this point on, it's very similar to using a multiple file input element. Only in this case, rather than using the event's target property, there's a property on the drop event called the data transfer property. Now, if you're not familiar with HTML5 drag and drop, there's a title available here on lynda.com called HTML5 drag and drop in depth, and you can go watch that title if you're not familiar with it. But I'm just going to assume that you're familiar with the data transfer property right here, and it makes the files that were dropped available to me the same way that the file input element would do. Below that, I have my running tally of total bytes here. And I'm going to clear out the file data section each time a drop occurs, so I don't have to refresh the page. And then I have the same for loop as I had previously in my example where we handled multiple files with a file input element. So we get the file information, the name, the size, so on, increment our running tally, add the file information to the file data div, and then put the summary at the bottom, the total number of files and the total number of bytes. So I'm going to save that. All that's left to do now is copy in the code that initializes the event handlers, and that's right here. Notice that since we don't have an input element anymore, the event handlers are slightly different. So now on the drop div, I'm going to add some event listeners. I'm going to add a listener for drop and a listener for drag over. So that's all we need to do. I'm going to save, and I have to copy this over to my local web server, so I'm going to do that and then jump to the browser. All right, so here we are in the browser, and I've copied my file over to the server. And I'm just going to refresh to make sure I have the most up-to-date code. And then I'm going to bring up the folder that contains the file assets. Here's the folder with the file assets in it. You can see I've got my various file types. So I'm just going to go ahead and select some files. I'll select that one, and I guess I'll select that one too. And then I'm going to just drag and drop. And you can see that when I drop, the same results that we saw earlier with the file input element with a multiple handler on it, we get the same results here. So I have 3 files, a JPEG, a PDF, and a Flash file. And I've got my total tally down here. So let's just do all the files. Let's go back to the folder. And then copy everything in. And you can see in this case, now we've got 10 files selected and the same result we saw earlier, about 30.5 megabytes. So that's how you can select files using both drag and drop and using the file input element. All right, so this brings us to the close of this chapter. So now that we've seen how to select files and get information about them, let's move on to the part where we actually read their contents.